All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Ian McLaughlin, and I have a PhD in neuroscience from the University of Pennsylvania. And today, I want to talk about an update to a topic that I've talked about in the past, Neuralink, and the prospect of whole brain-computer interfaces. So if that all sounds like gibberish to you, don't worry. It's actually quite a bit simpler than you think, or you might think. And if you're interested in a deeper dive into this, into the sort of backstory of this company and its goals and the sort of history of this whole thing, I have some links to podcast episodes that I did on whole brain-computer interfaces in the description below. But fundamentally, what we're going to talk about is the prospect of implanting technology into our bodies that'll enable us to far more effectively, efficiently interact with computers. That's the basic point, right? The use of implants to make it significantly easier and maybe more importantly faster for us to interact with computers. But let's go ahead and start at the beginning. So Neuralink is a company that was established by Elon Musk. Yes, that Elon Musk. But then again, also this Elon Musk. And so obviously he's just one person, right? And clearly has quite a few brilliant people working for him at SpaceX and also Neuralink. But I think anyone who, refuses to acknowledge that this was just flat out amazing probably has a different agenda that's kind of unrelated to just, assessing the engineering and the science, right? So we're talking about a company that was established by Elon Musk, right? Neuralink. Fundamentally, this is a neuroengineering company. And the goal is to create technology that's small and effective enough to be implanted into the brain, but effective enough to enable a substantial proportion of the brain to send and receive information from computers. And here's a picture of what they demonstrated a while back. Okay, so the primary goal of this company is to increase the bandwidth by which humans can interact with computers. And by bandwidth, we're talking about, again, how rapidly and efficiently you can transmit a thought or signals to a computer. And so right now, right, if you're going to type out a comment, right, you'd be limited to how rapidly you can move your fingers, right? How much you've practiced typing, of course, whether it's on a keyboard or a mobile device. I'm absolute garbage on mobile devices, quite a bit faster on keyboards, but that's really the fundamental limiting factor between, the emergence of a thought in your mind, in your brain, and the manifestation of that thought on a computer. How rapidly can you move your fingers, right? And so the concept behind implanting something like this, something like a whole brain-computer interface, well, this is just one, but many of these, the kind that Neuralink is developing, in other words, is that there would be a far more direct interaction between the neurons underlying, the original thoughts that are ultimately translated to finger movements, and then the reception of those thoughts by computers. It's, all electronic, no finger movement necessary. Just bypass the need for, physical interaction altogether by just routing the activities of the neurons that would have motivated those fingers to move, in the first place. Just bypass that and send them directly to a computer. Very awesome, right? Very cool. Really, the kind of thing that was in science fiction books that likely, at least in part, motivated me to get into science in the first place. Okay. So they followed that presentation of this device with a demonstration involving some pigs who were implanted with the latest iteration of Neuralink, at least at the time. Okay, and I think this was under a year ago at this point, but somewhere around August of 2020.
Okay.
And so here
this is
you can see this, and hopefully you can still hear it, and I'm not just drowning out with my voice.
All right.
But what you're seeing
Gertrude,
and
thanks for
hearing
coming out.
is something that's done in tons of labs.
So
around,
what you're,
throughout
the beeps
world.
you're hearing are
you're
real-time
what
signals
I'm pretty sure
from
is the activity of
the
either one or several
Neuralink in
neurons
Gertrude's head.
associated with the pig's
So this
nose,
Neuralink
the
connects
snout,
to neurons that
firing
are
impulses
in
and
her
sort of
snout.
pokes around its
So
body,
whenever
right?
she
That's
snuffles
sort of
around and touches something with her snout,
and so here's a little bit
that
of
sends out
neuroscience history. So back in the day,
neural spikes,
we were trying
which
to
are detected
record and
here.
understand the activity
Okay.
of neurons. Neuroscientists used to rely on essentially listening to a sound-based output, okay, to know when they were successfully recording from a neuron. They poke a neuron with, a brain cell with an electrode that basically enables us to get a sense of when a neuron starts chattering, right, and becomes active, and when it's quiet and not doing anything. And so we can set this whole, system up such that whenever a neuron fires an action potential, whenever it fires a spike, what you might call, an impulse, though they're not quite the same thing, but we can set it up so that whenever a neuron does that, there's a super short sound, right? And so actually the intro of some of my most recent podcast episodes have a whole train of these spikes that's probably, and what you're hearing is the sound of neuronal spikes, right? It sounds a bit like what, maybe old school radios used to sound like when you're scanning between stations, or like what old school TVs used to sound like when, you hit a channel that had no feed, right? Or, I'm clearly like aging myself with these references. But anyways, the point is that it typically, would sound something like brr, 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 right? And so what the team at Neuralink did was, with their system here,
this is
that they assigned a different
high energy pig
output as opposed to the classic.
All right.
Brr, you're hearing what might
thanks
sound
for
like a
coming out.
keyboard, which is,
So
nice.
what you're
And so I'm not entirely clear on what the different tonality indicates in their demonstration, but I suspect it just indicates like increased activity from a whole group of neurons, right? I'm not 100% certain because there haven't been any scientific releases from the company, but I'm pretty sure that it's specifically neuronal activity associated with touch, as the pig is the touch that the pig is experiencing, so not smell. And of course, we can't be entirely sure that this was actually authentic readouts of neuronal activity rather than just like they were playing an audio track. But, just having like watched the video when it was live, it definitely looked like the real deal. So, you're seeing audio output of neurons firing in the brain of a pig as it's poking around with its snout. And that's super amazing, right? You're hearing the activity of specific neurons in real time. So I'll play it one more time, just
this
so
is
you sort of
this is high energy pig. All right. Gertrude, thanks for coming out.
So that's the main idea. Okay. And I remember the first time I ever heard activity of like a specific neuron firing an action potential, when I was in the lab, or, you might call them impulses, while I was like handling the electrode, not with my hands, right, with micro manipulators, but still, I was still moving it. It just seemed like it wasn't even real. It's also, by the way, super difficult. And neuroscientists, who do it regularly, right, for their research are incredibly talented, and they're typically called electrophysiologists. They're neuroscientists, but they're electrophysiologists. So that was a super cool demonstration, but to be clear, this wasn't the kind of thing that, that like rocket landing on the platform in the middle of the ocean seemed to represent. Like, I think that was a pretty unprecedented achievement. I can tell you that like similar types of neuronal recording is performed throughout the United States and in tons of other countries on a daily basis. Like even just, the lab in which I did my PhD, my colleagues did something called tetrode recording. Don't worry about, what exactly that means. And we could get data from, quite a few more neurons than seem to have been represented by that Neuralink demonstration. And I'm not trying to like minimize the achievements of Neuralink, in that presentation. I'm just trying to put them into context for, so to give you some context, right? The real innovations that were demonstrated, by Neuralink were two primary things: miniaturization and wireless transmission. And the wireless transmission of data isn't like a completely novel innovation. It's not like they just absolutely invented it from scratch. That's something that's been available throughout neuroscience labs, right? Let's see. It's not receiving. No, hopefully that'll fix it. Well, bear with me. Speaking of wireless transmission, my Wi-Fi isn't being particularly cooperative. But, so two primary innovations: miniaturization and wireless transmission, right? And that's, a wireless transmission is available in neuroscience labs throughout the country and throughout the world. But it's the combination of the sort of teeny tiny little size of the device coupled with wireless transmission that was, it was a meaningful innovation. And I happened to work, closely with a truly brilliant neuroscientist engineer while I was working on my PhD. I actually just talked to him the other day, and he was really a one-man band. He was basically doing everything on his own. He got, his a tetrode micro drive. Again, don't worry about that. Just think of it as like, the technology you would need to record from neurons. He got that thing down to a tiny, like an impossibly tiny size. But there just wasn't a need for us to make it wireless, right? We didn't, that wasn't a necessary aspect to complete the science. And so I know tetrode microdrive probably sounds like pure gibberish to a lot of people, but this is the method that was used in the lab that enables us to record from many more neurons than were at least seem to have been represented in that Neuralink demonstration. And my colleague was working with mice, by the way. And I almost certainly don't have to emphasize how much smaller a mouse's brain is relative to a pig. So it's even more challenging. So when you're working at that size. But so, another thing to keep in mind is that when you're trying to understand what's going on with that Neuralink demonstration, there's a reason that they selected that sort of tactile neuronal readout, right, of the snout. And I know, this probably isn't like particularly thrilling content, but I figure if you're watching to this point, you probably, you want to have a sense of how a neuroscientist would watch a demonstration like this, right? So there are certain parts of the brain that are significantly more accessible than others. Okay, the brain is a 3D structure, right? There are parts of the brain that are deeper than others. And so here's a comparison of brain sizes that includes the human brain and the pig brain, with then also the brain of a monkey and a rat. So on top you're seeing pictures of what like the brains just look like from the side, like if you were just pop mine out and take a look at it. On the lower level, though, you're seeing what it looks like if you were to slice the brain right down the middle, okay? And so, it's pretty clear that there are certain parts of the brain that are like immediately beneath the skull, easier to reach, to access. And then as you move deeper, away from the top of the skull, you're traveling deeper and deeper into the brain, right? But as you travel further and further into the brain, you're moving through a variety of different brain regions, okay? And so, just as an example, look at that image of the brain right next to MRI images, so right there. So you see, the wrinkly parts, right? The outside of the brain is wrinkly, and it's pretty thick, right? This whole wrinkly part, quite a bit wrinklier, than other regions of the brain. And then take a look at the monkey brain and the pig brain. Okay, huge difference in how much sort of wrinkly brain material human brains have relative to our other animal cousins. So that's a whole topic of its own, but I only bring this up for two reasons. First, to give you a sense of like just the differences between the human brain and the pig brain. They are really quite similar relative to all the nervous systems that exist on the planet, or I suppose the universe, as far as we're aware. But second, and more importantly, I want you to have a sense of just how much depth there is to the human brain relative to pigs. Okay, so if you only have access to the outermost layer of the brain, you're clearly missing out on what's going on in deeper parts of the brain. Right? If you're only recording from neurons, right, there are hundreds of thousands, millions, billions of neurons just on that outermost region of the brain, but there's billions that are buried deeper, right? So you're missing out on what's going on in those deeper structures if you're only recording from the outermost layers. So, it's just going to be much easier to access the outermost regions of the brain. And so diving deeper into why Neuralink did what they did with this demonstration. So here's a map of the pig somatosensory cortex. So, I know this probably looks inscrutable once again, but just focus on what, you see that sort of orange coral color. I don't really know what color that would be called, but just sort of orange. Let's call it orange. That's the color that's associated with the rostrum. Okay, and so that's where the neurons associated with the sort of touchy feelings that come from the pig's nose were. So at least I assume so. Again, there were no scientific publications. So the neurons in that area are the ones that respond when our piggy friend in the Neuralink video pokes around with its snout. So okay, who cares, right? The reason I bring all of this up is to highlight what this brain region, or highlight the fact that this brain region is right directly on top of the brain, just beneath the skull. If you were to remove a region of the skull in precisely the right place, you're going to have access to that primary somatosensory cortex that's associated with the rostrum, right, or the snout. And so that's why Neuralink decided to go with this demonstration, at least I think, okay? It's pretty, frankly, like, as I watch that, and again, like, I thought it was really, really cool, but it's kind of reminiscent of, like, the stories of how electricity and light bulbs were demonstrated in, like, the early days of those technologies. It was a smart way to demonstrate the capability of a technology because, you're starting with a rather safe and simple goal, recording from the outermost regions of the brain. And it looks really quite impressive to people who are, interested in the prospects of this kind of an endeavor, right? So mission accomplished. But, the actual goal is to attract the interest of people who have money to invest, right? That's really their goal. So it seems like mission accomplished, right? In general, Neuralink managed to be both impressive to potential investors and fairly inoffensive and perhaps sort of unimpressive to neuroscientists. So that's where the team at Neuralink was about a year ago, just under a year ago. They demonstrated some real progress in miniaturization while sustaining wireless capabilities. Really very cool. And I should note that that they'd also introduced what seemed like the other half of the value proposition from Neuralink. It basically a pseudo-automated surgical device that would enable, that would actually perform the surgery necessary for the implantation of a Neuralink device. Okay, and so this is what the device looks like, at least as of quite a few months ago. And it's not that there wouldn't be any neurosurgeon involved or present, but it would just minimize the need for a neurosurgeon to like physically intervene and participate in the surgery. So they showed this device during that whole demonstration, involving their pigs, but it was really just like sort of a video of what the devices look like. We didn't see them like in action, actually performing any surgeries or anything, which, it makes sense given that I assume that the surgeries would take like a few hours at this stage, so probably even longer than their entire demonstration was. But Neuralink has been providing updates on their progress, including this, and they put out a video of their progress regarding this device. And so the whole idea is that sort of snout-like area of the surgical device that would hold a person's head. It looks sort of like a helmet, right? It would hold a person's head and then ultimately guide the surgery with like cameras and sensors and mechanisms to monitor the progress of the surgery. And evidently which is kind of cute, they intended to design a machine that has features that are somewhat anthropomorphic, or at least like non-threatening. And I think they did a pretty good job. Like, it looks like like an Apple device or something like that. And similarly, right, this topic can be kind of freaky to a lot of people. And so they managed to avoid coming up with a strategy that looks sort of like Dr. Satan. If you're unfamiliar with what this is, I'll take it off the screen because it's a little jarring, because if you don't know who Dr. Satan is or was, not a real person, by the way. So, I suspect that was a prudent design move. Okay, so yeah, so I dig it, right? I dig what Neuralink is up to. I like the fundamental goal of the company, which is to ultimately create a whole brain-computer interface. The reason I bring this up, it's a laudable goal, right? But fundamentally, this is a topic for another day. But what they reported last year was encouraging, and it was exciting, and it didn't blow our socks off. But that's definitely not the threshold for excitement in biotech. This was some meaningful innovation, and it was exciting not only because it represented progress towards their ultimate goal, but also because, even just the device they developed at its current stage would have been precisely the kind of thing that I certainly would have looked into for my own basic research, depending upon the cost and the feasibility. Like, it's a pretty handy device for conducting just basic neuroscience research, at least as far as we're aware, given what they presented and have made public. But so I think it's worth acknowledging that there has been some turmoil at Neuralink headquarters. Okay. And, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but according to reporting by Stat, which is, by the way, pretty much the best sort of like biotech, biosciences news outlet, the company has dealt with some pretty significant growing pains. And so that's what the article is called, if you can access it. So it seemed like there was some pretty substantial tension between the sort of engineers at Neuralink and the scientists at the company. And that the company imposed kind of deadlines that were like over the top and totally unrealistic and created a pressure cooker atmosphere. And this led to only 2 of the founding 8 scientists remaining at the company. Okay, so most have now departed. And, one of the early positive signs of the company was really the serious caliber of the scientists who composed that initial group. So there was Paul Merola, who was the lead chip designer at IBM, handy person to have, Max Hodak, DJ Seo, Tim Gardner, Ben Rappaport, Tim Hansen, Philip Sabis. And, these are people who have like some serious track records in neuroscience and in engineering and in neuroengineering. And, I don't know who among the founding team has departed from the company at this point, but the main critique seemed to be that they were just approaching the development of a biomedical device from the perspective of a tech company, right? And the experiences, the sort of framework of a tech company, move fast, break things, that kind of strategy. Hey, maybe that's a good thing, but maybe that's a not so good thing, right? But it's a thing that happened to Neuralink. So perhaps it's just the case that the company benefited from the main contributions of the basic scientists, and the primary things that they needed to accomplish at that point are things like further miniaturization and production and like, surgical procedure and regulatory stuff, with the FDA and stuff, to actually get to the point where they're working with humans. and they'll coast for a while without the need of any more input from scientists. So it didn't really hurt them. And that is until they accomplish their next milestone, right? As they make more progress towards a whole brain-computer interface, where I suspect scientists will again become rather critical. But so maybe at some other point I'll do a deeper dive into the topic of whole brain-computer interfaces. But let's get into the latest update from the company. This is why I really want to talk about it today. So they've moved from pigs to monkeys, to non-human primates. So, and beyond that, they've moved on to implanting more than one device, right? Meaning that they're able to engage quite a few more neurons than they had engaged in our pig friend. So, to be clear, like, the reason that we know about this, it's not like they put out a press release or something like that. It's because Elon Musk went on an app called Clubhouse, which is basically, if you're not familiar with Clubhouse, it's sort of like a live collaborative podcast social media platform. And so he used that platform and he talked about what was going on at Neuralink. And again, I haven't seen any actual scientific publications or anything out of the company. And, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Like, biotech and pharma companies don't really publicly publish their own internal research. That's why we call it private research. Rather than the publicly funded research that occurs at like major research universities and so on. That's the kind of the work that I did, right? And so Musk seems to pretty closely, so he talked about the kind of broader philosophical kind of framework that he used to found Neuralink. And he seems to pretty closely adhere to a model called the triune brain, right? And so this is a hypothesis from the 1960s. And it's sort of a modified triune brain, or at least the way he talks about it. So the triune brain argues that the human brain consists of three main parts, right? The reptilian complex, the reptile brain or reptilian brain, the limbic system, and the neocortex, okay? So the version that he describes, right, basically collapses the reptilian complex and the limbic system into just the limbic system, which leaves us with two biological components of the brain, and then suggests that our interactions with technology represents a tertiary component of human consciousness, okay? So, we fortunately can stick to that comfy triune model, right? Very handy to just have three parts of the brain that you're concerned with, right? And honestly, I have zero problem with simplifying neuroscience to make it intelligible or coherent to people outside of the discipline, right? Explanations can get so granular that the explanations only make sense to like 200 people in neuroscience across the globe, right? But I do think it is worth avoiding simplifications that can produce misunderstandings. More importantly, if a company like Neuralink is approaching their project with a model of the brain as being essentially like two biological divisions, my skepticism's, senses are triggered. And you'd be absolutely right to be skeptical that this is how Elon Musk actually describes the brain or actually understands a brain. And, but I'm going to quote him right now. So, and I have a link to the Clubhouse, the conversation he had on Clubhouse in the description. So somebody recorded it and uploaded it to YouTube. So here's his quote, "You have your limbic system, which is your primitive drives and desires and responses. And then you got your cortex, which is like long-term planning and thinking. Those are two biological layers. And then there's a tertiary layer, third layer, which is digital. And you already have that in the form of your phones and your computers and your applications." So that's the end of that first quote. So, this is not radically off base, right? It's true that our limbic system regulates primitive drives and desires. And it's true that the neocortex, to which I assume Musk was primarily referring with his, that second layer, is critical to the longer term planning that humans are particularly good at doing relative to our, primate relatives. And I do 100% agree with perceiving our current relationships with, technology as being kind of like an extension of our brain, right? Extension of our consciousness. I have zero problem with the notion of portraying our phones and computers as a sort of like metaphorical cortex of some kind, right? I kind of dig it. I think it's helpful. But it's helpful to understand our relationship with these devices and how our consciousness is influenced by them. Okay. Okay. Oh, sorry. I see the audio was too high. Sorry about that. Well, at least you heard the audio. I was worried that you weren't going to be able to hear anything. But so a model like this is really only useful, this like modified triune brain, model, the one that Elon Musk is describing, it's only really useful to someone who's just sort of like superficially interested in the brain, right? To suggest that there's like essentially two main parts of the brain is like suggesting there's like two main parts of a car, right? The steering wheel and the engine. And that's like true, but those are two distinct and important parts of a car, arguably, right? They're the two most important parts of the car, arguably, right? But it's a pretty arbitrary division. The reality is that there's quite a few more parts that are necessary for you to enable you to like make the car drive. and if you neglect them, you're gonna have a pretty crappy car and a poor understanding of how a car works. And so the brain is incredibly complicated, and it's more complicated than cars, and it sort of defies a kind of like a cognitively satisfying or almost aesthetically satisfying explanation as a result, because it's the byproduct of like a super messy process of evolution and by natural selection, rather than like a perfectly engineered McLaren F1 or something, right? Our brain is more like an SUV that's kind of like held together with like bubblegum and duct tape and WD-40, right? It's a super nice SUV, don't get me, to be fair, but it's far from like a coherently devised organ, perfectly devised organ. There are tons of examples of like suboptimal architecture and development of the brain, and of course suboptimal behavioral outputs that cause immense suffering as a result, right? Why do people do the terrible things that they do, that we do? Things that are objectively even against our best interests, because we're all working with brains that are just far from optimal, and therefore consciousness that's far from optimal. So, okay, back to his comments on Neuralink on Clubhouse, Elon Musk's. So, quote, "We can improve the bandwidth between your cortex and your digital tertiary layer by many orders of magnitude, probably at least 1,000 or maybe 10,000 or more. We could also spend a lot of time thinking about interesting things as opposed to taking complex thought structures, compressing them down into words, which also, again, very low bit rate, and then having someone else receive those words, decompress them, and send the words back at you." Okay, so, the same point I made earlier applies here, right? The notion that like one specific component of your consciousness will be interfacing with a computer, it isn't coherent, doesn't make sense scientifically. And if, even if they only implant, a Neuralink device that like just literally targets the neocortex right on the outside of the brain, a huge variety of additional systems influences the cortex, right? So no matter what you're targeting, assuming that you're targeting more than just one single region or one single neuron, you're going to be engaging a much wider network than just one system, But the rest of what he said, I love it. Like, I think it's great. The whole concept of, compressing human thoughts into language, decompressing them as they're sort of filtered through your brain, through your consciousness, your experiences, memory, these types of your emotion. I love that way to think about, how we convey thoughts and feelings and stuff to each other, and how we can be limited by language, as very, very useful as it is. So, he provides more of the rationale behind the effort, as well as like some of the potential applications of having a device like this. And it's all super fun and totally fair game. And, I'm absolutely on that same page, right? This would be a fundamentally transformative event, right, in human evolution if we were something like this were to come to fruition. So, but my point is that this model that Musk provides, this sort of like, neo-triune brain model, it just shouldn't really be deployed at this point anymore, right? He has plenty of justification based on his, concerns regarding artificial intelligence, and it's really just an outdated and frankly fairly inaccurate heuristic, right? We have better ways to explain human consciousness and the relationship between neuroanatomy and consciousness. You don't need to rely on this decades-old, model. And so, to be fair, it's not, I honestly don't think that Elon Musk is like sitting in front of like the whiteboards at Neuralink headquarters and like drawing out circuit schematics to figure out which brain regions they ought to target first with their devices. And, I know the company has been focused on targeting totally realistic applications in the immediate future, right? They're not starting with the goal of just, we're making a whole brain computer interface, and until we get there, we're doing nothing, right? They're focused on things like providing increased capabilities to folks who are quadriplegic, enabling, in other words, folks who are paralyzed to control like computer keyboards and things like that, via these kinds of implants. And so the reason I thought it was worth discussing this today, right, again, is that they've moved from pigs to monkeys. And, as complex as pigs are, there's a pretty substantial increase in complexity and seriousness as a result when, conducting any kind of experiment with a non-human primate, with, a monkey, in other words, or an ape. So Musk said that they're working with wireless Neuralink implants in the monkeys with whom they're working, and here's what he said about that. And this was probably the most important part of what he said. Perhaps revealing a little bit more than his team was ready to reveal. I'm not entirely sure, but we've already got, quote, we've already got a monkey with a wireless implant in their skull and the tiny wires who can play video games using his mind. Looks totally normal and happy. Doesn't look like an unhappy monkey. And you can't even see where the neural implant was put in, except he's got a slight dark mohawk. But other than that, he's normal. He's not uncomfortable, and he doesn't look weird. So, and that's the end of the quote. So, this was like a totally informal setting. That's the kind of the whole point of Clubhouse, that app, that social media platform. And it's not like he was reading out, clinical trial results or anything like that, right? But the fact that they started working with non-human primates and that they're testing out some evidently taking him at his word, some kind of computer interaction task. That's pretty meaningful, and that's a big step from the relatively simple demonstration that they did with the pig, where they were just recording from neurons. They're now using from neurons in what almost certainly was a very accessible region of the brain, in a very simple task, right? I've done very similar types of experiments with rodents, recording from the neurons that are involved in, whiskers. Like, their whiskers are very important. That's sort of, they have terrible eyesight, and so they can use their whiskers to sort of feel around things. And I've literally recorded from neurons where you tickle a whisker and you can hear it bleeping, right? And that's what they did with their pigs. So what he's talking about here with a non-human primate, that's a different level of seriousness and ambition. And so, again, like, I can't actually verify this, right? But as someone who's worked with animals, like, I appreciate that he's at least felt the obligation to say this last thing in his quote. So, quote, when the USDA came through and inspected our monkey facilities, she said it was like the nicest monkey facility she's ever seen in her entire career. Just FYI, we went the extra mile for the monkeys. So that, that's not necessarily critical for understanding how much progress Neuralink has made, but it's important, right? That the animals with whom we're working are treated, ethically, with dignity, because without them we'd be essentially nowhere in biomedical science. But perhaps more importantly, regarding the progress that Neuralink has made, he describes some of the ideas that they have for tests for the monkeys who have Neuralinks, after a joke he made about the game Cyberpunk, which is a great game. But anyways, quote, one of the things we're trying to figure out is, can we have the monkeys play mind pong with each other? That would be pretty cool. So end of the quote. So once again, I have no idea if he's just being like a goofball, which, is sort of his want, right? He does that regularly. But if they're seriously getting to the point where they're like actually engaging the notion of two monkeys playing pong against each other via implants alone, that's awesome. That's absolutely awesome. But I sort of suspect he was just being a goofball and probably exaggerating, as he's prone to do. So finally, I dug where he ended his discussion of Neuralink on this Clubhouse chat. So, quote, the early applications will really be for people who've had a serious brain injury. Like, the value of the implant will be enormous because the early implants will come with non-trivial risk. So, does the good far outweigh the bad? And that'll be a candidate for some of the initial surgeries, with full disclosure of the risks and everything. And one of the things we're paying close attention to is the ability to remove the implants. If someone doesn't want it or it's not working, we can take it out and reimplant another one. So we've tested implantation, removal, and reimplantation, and it works great. End of the quote. So that's super fun, okay? And once again, the reason I thought I'd do an update on this is because, we're clearly moving forward into more complicated animal models. And, at least theoretically, they're ambitious enough to start entertaining the notion of having non-human primates engage computer systems and interacting with each other via their implants, right? It's on a simple platform, but still, that's some serious business. And, once again, it's not the kind of thing that's completely unheard of, right? So again, sort of putting this into context here, other labs throughout the country, including the lab in which I worked, performs similar experiments on like a daily basis. The motivations and goals are slightly different, of course. In the labs, it's generally just the pursuit of knowledge, perhaps knowledge that might, yield treatments for disease and stuff like that. But it's really just the pursuit of knowledge that guides, the work of basic scientists. While Neuralink is working towards developing a product. Okay. And so, I think it's worth acknowledging that Neuralink certainly isn't the only company, on the map that's working on this kind of thing. Very similar types of companies exist. So BrainGate, for example, which is a project out of a group at across Brown, Stanford, and Case Western universities, as well as Massachusetts General Hospital, a fabulous biomedical institution. And so that's what you're seeing here. BrainGate has been exploring ways to enable people to interface with computers directly, which you can see here, right? A woman who's paralyzed is basically able to control movements on a screen, and they demonstrate a video of this by the recorded activity of neurons in her primary motor cortex. And you can see literally, like, it's not wireless, right? But you can see the technology that they have there. And BrainGate is just one example. So there's BrainCo, Emotive, Kernel, MindMaze, NeuroSky, NeuroPro, NeurAble, Paradromics, and others. A lot of neuros, right? And that there. By the way, there was just an announcement of a brain-computer platform in China called Neuromatrix, which has evidently raised millions of dollars in funding, and they claim that their device is comparable to Neuralink's in terms of signal acquisition accuracy and reduced power requirements. Okay, and again, that's just a small sampling of the companies all over the world who are pursuing similar goals to Neuralink. So another example, the last time I attended the Society for Neuroscience conference, which was in Washington D.C., I saw a company that if memory serves, I'm pretty sure I wrote it down at least. They were out of Austria, called RecoveryX. Okay, and recovery with an I rather than a Y if you want to check it out. And the things they were able to accomplish using a brain-computer interface, which, by the way, importantly, was completely non-invasive, quite remarkable. Okay, so the goal of that company, RecoveryX, was not to develop a sort of whole brain-computer interface, not necessarily, right? And that's the goal of Neuralink. So RecoveryX was focused on generating novel treatments for people who suffer strokes. Okay, so it's a longer story, but the ultimate goal here is to measure activity in parts of the brain using an EEG, which you can see here on this person's head, and then stimulate parts of the body that were paralyzed due to the stroke as a sort of like workaround, right? But the workaround can ultimately result in therapeutic recovery, which they've demonstrated, because the brain generates new connections, right? That's the fundamental goal of like the therapy that people go through, physical therapy that people go through after a stroke, or any kind of brain damage that causes paralysis. The goal is for this company, is to basically bypass the damaged parts of the brain and generate new connectivity. Sorry. But yeah, and this was very cool. As like a very effective marketing demonstration, the company showed that they were able to use their platform to enable someone to type on a keyboard using their mind alone after only having sit in their device for like 5 minutes. And they did like a couple tests to essentially calibrate the system, but it was remarkable. And then they were able to control a kind of like remote control ball thingy, think of like a remote control car, but this is a ball that rolls. These people with these EEG caps on, they were able to control that remote control ball thing via just the EEG and the software alone. It was pretty impressive. And so, my point here is that there are quite a few entities that are pursuing goals that are sort of fall in the same category of Neuralinks. And, it's probably pretty obvious that I'm not a huge fan of that simplified, neo-triune brain model that Elon Musk, regularly deploys to describe how the company's device will interact with the human brain and consciousness. But I'm pretty excited that Neuralink, as well as all these other companies, are working towards this goal. And just because I'm not a fan of that Muskian triune brain concept doesn't mean that I think he's fundamentally wrong about the prospects of a general artificial intelligence, which is one of the main motivations for founding the company, as he's described it, and the need for humans to come up with our evolutionary strategy for us to remain relevant and survive during the age of artificial intelligence. And so I thought I would bring this up too. So one recent innovation in neuroengineering gives me at least some cause for hope, right? So a few years ago, a collaboration between Genelia, IMEC, and the Allen Institute for Brain Science, they released a new kind of electrode that can record from hundreds of neurons simultaneously, and like hundreds more neurons simultaneously than traditional probes or traditional electrodes. And so these are called Neuropixels, right? So you can see that's what it like would look like in your hand. You can see it's this sort of grid pattern of the probe here, and you can sort of see a comparison of like the typical probes that are used today and their probe on the bottom. And you can, you know, tell that they're making it clear that you can go deep into the brain with these neuropixels. And you can sort of think of them as sort of like lattices of electrodes, you know, rather than just sort of catching signals that are like right at the tip of an electrode. It sort of records from neurons from like, you know, whole regions of the brain. And so this should enable us to record from more than 10 times the neurons that these standard probes record. And ultimately, you know, if multiple neuropixels are implanted rather than just one, the number of simultaneously recorded neurons can begin to become quite substantial, right? Substantially more than I think is the current like record for maximum of simultaneously recorded neurons, which is about 500, right? Just a couple of these and you can go way beyond that. That's incredibly powerful and fairly game-changing from a research perspective. And so the reason I'm bringing up Neuropixels is because, you know, prior to the creation of this very innovative recording platform, electrophysiology platform, the notion of being able to record from many, many hundreds of, if not theoretically thousands, right, of neurons simultaneously would have sounded like science fiction, right? Just a few years ago, right? That not, you know, we're not talking about to a neuroscientist from like 1990s, right? We're talking like from 2012, right? Or 2015. I think these came out in 2016 or 2017. I'm not sure. But it just would have sounded like science fiction. And, you know, I bring this up because it's going to be innovations like this, right, that bring us closer to being able to plausibly approach the goal of a true whole brain-computer interface. You know, as we've all come to learn, right, when Elon Musk announces timelines, he's really speaking the language of attracting investment, right, and attention, of course, and excitement. And, you know, I'm excited about the work of these companies. And, you know, the reality is, if you want to more accurately calibrate your own expectations regarding, you know, regarding when we'll actually arrive at something even resembling what Musk describes, it's going to be a very, very long time, right? You know, they're going to start small, which is prudent, it's smart, but, you know, and they're explicit about this. You know, they're targeting specific diseased conditions, and pour some of the revenues that they generate from you know, the sales of their products to treat these conditions, pour some of the revenues into, you know, subsequent research and development as they pursue, you know, greater and greater sophistication of their Neuralink device. So, you know, my overall point here is that it is going to take quite a long time for the more romantic and ambitious goals that Musk describes to come to fruition. And to be clear, like, there are plenty of neuroscientists and neuroengineers who are entirely skeptical that it'll ever happen, right? Just given how frequently, you know, for me, and like, I totally get it. Like, you know, that is probably the most realistic posture to take right now regarding the viability of something like Neuralink's ultimate goals. But just given how frequently, you know, over the years we've seen those kinds of claims that like X, Y, or Z will never happen, just how frequently they happen to be proven untrue, I generally sustain a kind of optimistic skepticism, right? You know, but just like, don't hold your breath, right, for a demonstration of two humans playing, you know, Mortal Kombat or Call of Duty or something against each other just by using their Neuralinks, you know, or even sending, you know, simple primitive thoughts or even messages. It's going to be a while, right? And it'd be indistinguishable from like a miracle if something like this exists before I pass away, or perhaps even my daughter, my 2-year-old daughter, or her children, if she, you know, elects to have children, before they pass away, you know. But is it theoretically possible? If you accept that the brain and consciousness, the consciousness that it generates is fundamentally a physical system that obeys the laws of physics, then it's certainly theoretically possible, right? But it'll be one of the most difficult endeavors, maybe the most challenging endeavors that science and engineering will face to date. So, skepticism, but optimistic skepticism. Okay, that's what I have for you today. If you dug this, hopefully you'll consider subscribing. Also, there's a new live streaming platform called haps.tv, and it's what I'm likely going to be using to try and like sustain live chats that I've had with people, you know, in the past few years. And I've put a link in the description below in case you're interested. Let me make sure it's actually down there. And yes, it is. Okay, so it's the URL that has haps.tv in it. And so yeah, so if I'm going to be keeping my eye on Neuralink, of course. It's enticing. It's romantic. It's the kind of thing that I think many, if not most, neuroscientists would dream of existing. But I just think I just want to help people properly calibrate their expectations and understand what they're seeing when they do these sort of like Edison-esque or Tesla-esque demonstrations, with a pig, walking around with a wireless implant. Like, that is not earth-shattering, paradigm-shifting innovation. It is innovation, miniaturization, and wireless data transmission. That's meaningful progress, but it is not like magic, right? Yeah, sorry about that. That the pig video was so loud. Yeah, I have to figure out a way to better anticipate what that's going to sound like. I wonder if the monkey is playing the game or things are just happening and the monkey's reacting, having no idea what playing the game is. Very interesting overall. Yeah, indeed. Well, so, monkeys can, but, non-human primates can learn to do really complicated things with computer systems. Another topic that I was entertaining before I went with Neuralink today was just how remarkable a chimpanzee's memory is relative to a human memory. They have some capabilities that we do not have in terms of like cognitive performance. Now, I think there's a whole like the sort of cognitive trade-off hypothesis to describe why it is that chimpanzees have such better memories than we do. I mean, way better, like orders of magnitude more effective than human memory. But anyways, yeah, so they're capable of doing some pretty complex things. But you're absolutely right, Frank. Right? Yeah, you're absolutely right that like we have no way to scrutinize whether he just said that they've done that. We have no way to scrutinize whether it was just the ball just happened to be bouncing and the monkeys were sitting there doing something, but whether or not they were actually controlling that slider, they would have to demonstrate that in a peer-reviewed publication before we were like, yeah, for sure, they did that. That's awesome. Hi, Dan Sims. Why not? I am who I am is possible. Sorry, I missed the whole show. No worries. Me too. I'm going to focus more on Neuralink. Yeah, I mean, and Dan, no, I mean, obviously you can, always start from the beginning, but Neuralink isn't the only game in town as well, Dan. So like, Neuralink, everything that Elon Musk does gets way more attention than pretty much any other company, right? But I named several other companies that are doing very similar things, many of which are in the United States, but many are internationally. I talked about a demonstration from a company in Austria that was just unbelievably impressive. There's a company in China called Neuromatrix, which just recently got like millions of dollars in essentially seed funding. And they're claiming that their device is pretty comparable to Neuralink. Totally possible. And so, that's another source of my optimism. I didn't really, I guess, state this. Like, that's another source of my optimism that we will eventually develop something like a whole brain computer interface. Maybe not in the near future. Maybe not before, my time has passed. But with that many groups of people, really, really smart and ambitious people working on a project like this, that's encouraging. So. Yeah, is it fair to think being able to record neurons in its current state is similar to the early stages of mapping the genome? Yeah, totally. And the end result could be as or more fantastic. Frank, I was literally going to use that comparison. While mapping the human genome was a mammoth challenge, and it's an interesting story, by the way, that basically mapping the human genome or sequencing the human genome is what we're talking about, right? Was basically the byproduct of competition between like a company and essentially academic labs. And the reality is that both of those approaches, and they were using different approaches, and the company just happened to use an approach that was called shotgun sequencing that was just more efficient, so they could just do it more rapidly. But the reality is the academic lab would have gotten there too. It just would have taken a little bit longer, or a fair bit longer. Francis Collins, by the way, the current long time director of the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, which funds the vast majority of, well, not the vast majority, the majority of publicly funded biomedical research. He's the director of the NIH. He was participated in that early human genome project. But then Craig Venter, did shotgun sequencing. Anyways, the reason I'm bringing all this up is that, like, at the time we had the technology necessary to do it. It was just a matter of getting everybody together and focusing on this one task for a sustained period of time, a period of time that stretches beyond the sort of typical kind of horizons that biomedical projects have. To give you a sense, like, if I were to write a grant to the NIH, I would be evaluated every year, and generally speaking, my goal would be achievable within 2 years, maybe a couple more years than that. Otherwise, that's just not how we fund research these days. And so the Human Genome Project required much, a more sustained effort. And so the point is that, we had the technology. It was just a matter of will, and funding and stuff like that. When it comes to recording from, many, many thousands, and, for a whole brain computer interface, this figure changes a bit. But, people talk about a threshold of needing to record simultaneously from, like, somewhere around 11 million neurons out of our 86 billion. There's no real way to know whether or not that is sufficient, but it's theoretically possible. You just get a sampling of signals as they're moving through the brain. At a certain point, you don't need to know the status of every single neuron in the brain to have a sort of meaningful interface with the computer. That makes sense to me. But, whether it's 11 million, whether it's a billion, whether it's 11 billion, whatever it is, we just don't have the technology that enables us to do that yet. We don't have the technology in terms of, like, the physical things in the brain that would interact with that many neurons. Although, I brought up Neuropixel. That's essentially an electric, or fundamentally an electrode, essentially, that can record from, many, many more neurons simultaneously than any probe system it has in the past. Innovations like that might get us there, but we don't have really the technology available to us yet to do that, to do it on a scale that would be meaningful for a whole brain computer interface. But then also just data handling, like the amount of data that electrophysiological recording consumes is just gargantuan, and it's consumed so rapidly. And so we need innovations in computer science as well, and computer engineering as well. Right? We need to be able to store more information in smaller spaces more efficiently, and we need to be able to handle mammoth amounts of data very efficiently, very rapidly, to be able to really meaningfully, meaningfully interact with the brain in a broad enough number of neurons to have a whole brain computer interface. But the comparison is very, very good. It's similar, right? What we would need, what would be optimal, is like a Manhattan Project style approach to, developing whole brain computer interface. That's what the Human Genome Project was, essentially. It was a Manhattan Project, fundamentally, where they just got a bunch of brilliant scientists together and all worked on it. We don't have that for a whole brain computer interface. We just have a bunch of we have like an archipelago of companies that are doing it independently, different strategies, different expertise, different, parts of the world, different scientists, obviously. And so, one wonders if we wouldn't expedite this process if, the federal government would decide we need a Manhattan Project to have a whole brain computer interface. It's just not going to happen, right? But yeah. Hey, Scott, good to see you, man. Regarding mapping the human genome, I remember being in high school in the 90s and the science and biology teachers like, it would be cool if it ever happens. Yeah, totally. Yeah. I mean, it was a huge, huge problem. And by the way, they mapped the human genome, and, at the time, similar problem with like just the amount of data that you'd be dealing with, because like, at the time there was just so much data, like to describe all the A, T, C's, and G's in our genome, but we had no idea what the function was, right? And we still don't know what the majority of genes do, particularly the genes that don't encode for a protein, right? They're just there. We used to call it junk DNA, but we know now that it's not junk. It regulates other genes. It plays, structural roles for the genome, so that is a similar sort of challenge where there's just like the bottleneck for that kind of research is just the amount of data. Okay. Why don't we go live? Am I ready? Are we ready? Yeah, I think so. Hello, everybody. My name is Ian McLaughlin, and I have a PhD in neuroscience from the University of Pennsylvania. And on YouTube, just now, I talked about a company called Neuralink. And so Neuralink is a company that was founded by Elon Musk a couple years ago. And I talked about the prospects of a whole brain computer interface being created, which is the goal of Neuralink. And I talked about some of their demonstrations and some of the most recent progress, according to Elon Musk, of the company. So I talked about that on YouTube, youtube.com/anthropoid. Also, I have been using a live streaming platform called Haps, haps.tv. And so there's a link to that in my profile on Periscope that you can find. You just click on the link and you'll be sent there. And here, let's see, what is, I feel like there's something up with my stream. But anyway, so you can check that out if you'd like. Given that Periscope is going to be shuttered in a couple weeks now, we're getting pretty close to the end there. So well, my insights regarding politics are a little bit more limited than those regarding neuroscience. And so I would recommend that you go elsewhere, and also spirituality. So recommend you go elsewhere. And so I also talked about, hey Jade, good to see you. I also talked about some other innovations not associated with Neuralink, but that I think would be potentially useful in getting us closer to having a whole brain-computer interface. Specifically a type of electrode, essentially called a neuropixel. That would theoretically enable us to record from more than 10 times the number of neurons that standard electrodes record from simultaneously. And so that would be pretty game changing, because for Neuralink or any other company to be able to develop a bona fide whole brain computer interface, they're going to need to be able to record from millions and millions, if not billions, of our 86 billion neurons simultaneously. And so, nerd alert, no kidding. Yeah, I'm proud of it. Will there soon be a cure for schizophrenia? Great topic. So, when you say cure, right, that would imply that, the end goal would be to completely eliminate, right, to reverse any of the causes of schizophrenia. And broadly speaking, that would probably involve some genetic therapeutics, and to just prevent it from manifesting in the first place. So it might be a little bit more realistic to think about more effective treatments for schizophrenia, right? So schizophrenia can be thought of as basically being like two categories of symptoms: primary schizophrenia, or primary symptoms, and not primary, positive and negative symptoms. And so we have and the positive symptoms are things like the kind of the frequently auditory hallucinations, the hallucinations that people can experience, but then also the sort of atypical ideation, the kind of word salad that can sometimes be associated. And then the negative symptoms are like the loss, the flattened affect. It can be severe enough where somebody can develop catatonia, where they just can't move. So those are the sort of capabilities that are lost. Okay. So, and we have pretty good treatments for the positive symptoms, right? Medications that treat things like, the hallucinations. And so, but we have pretty garbage treatments for the negative symptoms. And so, it's probably going to be a little bit more realistic to pursue, or in the immediate future, to pursue, better treatments for the negative symptoms of schizophrenia, better treatments for the symptoms in general. The challenge of schizophrenia is that it's a very, very complicated condition, right? It doesn't just emerge from one brain region. It doesn't emerge from like one problem that's occurring, sort of like, for example, Parkinson's disease. That disease is a byproduct of the accumulation of essentially misfolded protein called alpha-synuclein that then sort of aggregates in neurons, sort of like similarly to the way that like lint, develops in your pocket, right? Where the fibers of your pocket, the cloth, sort of break, and they, it starts to interact with each other, get tangled up, and then you get little lint bunnies, right? Kind of similar situation with the Lewy bodies that alpha-synuclein generates. And so, right, a cure for Parkinson's disease would theoretically, focus on targeting that specific thing that's happening. Whereas for schizophrenia, it's just a far more complicated set of issues, right? It's, multiple brain regions. It involves multiple neurotransmitter signaling systems. And so it's a very, very difficult challenge. And that's why there's a lot of effort that goes into just understanding what schizophrenia even is, or at least how it's generated in the brain. And once we have a better understanding of that, right, the sort of basic biology underlying schizophrenia, we'll be able to, develop more competent, or we'll be more competent in our development of medications and drugs to treat it. Is someone who is schizophrenic is in prison for something he wasn't in his right mind? Can so I think I know where you're going. Yeah, it is true that like a remarkable proportion, at least in the United States, right? Can some kind of treatment cure allow them to get out? Well, that's more, at least in part, more a question for a lawyer, right? A criminal defense attorney. But in terms of it is true and it's tragic that we have a huge proportion of our population is imprisoned relative to other countries, right? And it turns out that a huge proportion of those prisoners suffer from some kind of mental illness, and schizophrenia can be one of them, right? And so that's a huge problem. And while it is, and so as a result, like our prison system becomes a sort of like frontline, mental health treatment strategy, which is obviously not what it's for, and they have access to mental health resources and treatment, but it's just insufficient, right? A prison is not designed to treat mental illnesses, certainly including schizophrenia. And so there have been, I know, defenses that have been used successfully that involved things like my client had had a brain tumor or something in a certain part of the brain, and that's why they became violent, that's why they committed these atrocities, and so you can't hold them culpable for the crime that they committed. That's successfully been deployed in the past in a defense, but I don't know that it works every time, and I suspect that there is insufficient sympathy towards people who are suffering from a condition like schizophrenia who commit crimes. But also I think it's always worth acknowledging that in the vast majority of cases, people with schizophrenia and mental illnesses in general, but schizophrenia, are far more likely to be the victim of some kind of violent criminal act as opposed to commit them, right? So generally speaking, they're on the receiving end. But it's we have very poor treatments available for them, and so as a result, they can end up, a huge proportion of the homeless population suffers from schizophrenia, and so it's a real it's a real issue. It's certainly something to bring up, right, with some kind of defense, particularly if it didn't come up in court, right? Where's my mouse? There it is. My friend is a caretaker for someone who's schizophrenic. He smokes weed and it doesn't seem to have a bad effect, but he's taking cocaine. That's really messing him up. What's your view? Yeah, Jade, what's interesting about the relationship between like drugs and schizophrenia, a huge proportion of people who are diagnosed with schizophrenia smoke cigarettes, nicotine. And what's interesting about that is generally speaking, and there have been interviews of people with schizophrenia asking like why they smoke, what they enjoy about it, and I should a much bigger proportion of people with schizophrenia smoke cigarettes than just the proportion of people who smoke cigarettes in the sort of the average population, let's say, and in interviews, people with the condition will say like these cigarettes are relief, like they relieve me of the things from which I suffer, associated with my schizophrenia. So it's sort of like a self-medication. Oftentimes, the use of many drugs is sort of there is the sort of self-medication hypothesis where people, are essentially, putting a Band-Aid on a mental illness through the use of some kind of recreational substance. And very frequently addiction is some other kind of mental illness that's sort of masquerading as addiction, because people are self-medicating. Now, certainly, like, essentially any kind of drug like that, nicotine aside, right? Nicotine is not a particularly powerful, it doesn't powerfully alter your state of consciousness, really. It is very addictive, don't get me wrong, but it's not like cocaine, or it's not like, cannabis, where these are these very potently alter your states of consciousness. And so generally speaking, any mental illness, when somebody with any mental illness is exposed to any kind of mind-altering substance, that will generally speaking exacerbate it. Also, cannabis is sort of uniquely associated with when somebody is predisposed to schizophrenia. Cannabis, more so than other drugs do this, but cannabis seems to do it more so, will be associated with an increased conversion over to schizophrenia. So somebody who wasn't, displaying symptoms of schizophrenia after they smoke pot, they can convert over to schizophrenia. Now, it's important to note that is a minority of the population, right, who is vulnerable in that way or has that predisposition. So that is not the standard reaction, but it is a known, interaction. So, I can't tell you for sure if, certainly cocaine is not going to be helping the situation. And I can't tell you for sure, how any one person will react to cannabis, but there is that, that association. Generally speaking, I'm a scientist, I'm not a physician, but I suspect that most physicians would prefer that somebody with schizophrenia does not consume mind-altering substances like cannabis or cocaine, just because it probably just makes things a little bit less balanced. So yeah. Well, prisons are for profit, so it probably won't happen for a while. No kidding. Yeah. Yeah, I'm sorry to hear that. So, okay, this solution for chronic pain caused by damaged nerves, the Zulu on your scope. So chronic pain is a huge challenge, right? Because of course there are many things that can cause chronic pain. You're talking about what are you talking about? Neuropathy, I think, maybe peripheral neuropathy. And so that is just one way that chronic pain can arise, but it completely different disturbances of the nervous system can be quite painful too, like chronic inflammation, for example. An injury, right? Just like an injury to the back or something like that, or to the neck. And all of those things will generate pain in different ways. So peripheral neuropathy, which is I think what you're referring to, the reality is we just don't really have effective treatments for chronic pain. The treatments that we have right now are, mildly effective, if at all. In some cases, some scientists argue that opioid painkillers actually make that pain worse. Because people develop a substance dependence and they have to escalate their dose to achieve the therapeutic effect. And also the opioids, generally speaking, chronic pain travels up to the source of chronic pain travels to the brain via different mechanisms than like the kind of pain that opioids are quite good for. Like surgery associated pain, for example, right? That sort of dull chronic pain isn't really very effectively modulated by opioid signaling. And where does that leave us? It doesn't leave us with many very effective treatments, unfortunately. And so there is no real great, cure apart from, it totally depends on what's causing the damaged nerves. If it's like diabetes or if it's something like that, if it's literally an injury, these will be different sources of pain. But different pharmacological strategies have been shown to be moderately effective. Like, for example, some folks find gabapentin an effective, pain control mechanism. Some people definitely find CBD as effective for, moderating chronic pain. For some people it's sufficient, but for sure it's, and in some people it's been shown to actually exacerbate chronic pain, which is kind of alarming. It's kind of alarming because I think a lot of people will sort of portray CBD as being the panacea, right? It can treat everything, and it's great that for some people it is effective. So, and it's pretty harmless. So, it's fairly, worth checking out if you haven't tried it. But it's not necessarily like a super potent therapeutic or treatment. So some people have found combining gabapentin with opioids. Some physicians will do this, will prescribe them. Combining gabapentin with opioids can achieve a greater therapeutic effect than just either one of them on their own. But yeah, apart from that, there's not a lot. There are some things that are being explored, right? So for example, some scientists, some labs are exploring the ability of using the sort of capsaicin, the receptor to which capsaicin binds. Capsaicin is the molecule that makes things like habanero peppers or peppers in general spicy. They bind really a channel called the TRPV1 receptor, whatever, and that is the receptor that essentially gives us a sense of when something of temperature. It's basically a temperature sensor. And but it can also be associated with an endogenous pain-killing response, which is thought to be part of the reason for why some people really love spicy food, like ridiculously spicy food that would cause you to just like gag and hate whatever you're eating. Some people dig it because there is this sort of pain reducing analgesic, sort of pseudo analgesic effect of activation of TRPV1. So some labs are exploring whether or not we can exploit that for the treatment of things like chronic pain in a way that isn't as dangerous as opioids or as addictive, obviously. There are others there are labs that are exploring just novel sort of versions of opioid molecules that, when I'm saying opioids, I'm talking about drugs like oxycodone, morphine, hydrocodone, so OxyContin, Vicodin, Percocet, these types of medications. There are labs that are trying to modify a molecule such that it binds to the receptor that, again, oxycodone binds, but it binds that receptor in a way that minimizes the suppression of respiration, which is what people fundamentally die from when they overdose on opioids, and also potentially can make it so that these substances aren't as addictive as they were. Chronic pain is a symptom that needs to be addressed. Indeed. Yeah, I mean, it accounts for a huge amount of human suffering. I can't remember the stats that I saw, but like a massive, and if you're not so concerned with human suffering or whatever, it is also a source of massive loss of productivity, and there's an economic burden that results from people not really having an effective way to control their pain. But more importantly, it reduces people's quality of life. Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. And so the point I'm making is that there are groups that are working on, novel treatments and just better treatments for chronic pain. All right. Messes with his drugs. Right. Funny time because you're most likely abuse them, opioids. Wait, what? So 4 times. Oh, I see. Opioids almost killed me. 4 times. I assume you're overdosing. Yeah. Well, I'm glad to hear that they didn't, that you made it through. I mean, the opioid overdose, fatality epidemic in this country is, if we weren't living in the age of COVID right now, that would be almost certainly the sort of primary epidemic public health crisis that we'd be engaging because, literally over 80,000 people have passed away in the last 12-month chunk that the CDC, from which the CDC collects data. And that is more than have ever passed away from any drug overdose, in the history of the country, right? That is like gigantic numbers. That is far higher than like other public health crises to which the government responded, right? Like traffic fatalities, automobile fatalities before, seatbelts became mandatory, the HIV epidemic, and so on, right? So this is a real crisis, and my concern, and I get on my soapbox about this way too frequently to get into it deeply right now, but my concern is that the current strategy that's being employed is not only ineffective but counterproductive. I took my prescription and stopped breathing and sleeping 4 times. 4 times. So this was as they were prescribed? What? That is indefensible. If you were taking your prescription, if you were following your doctor's prescription, then that doctor needs to be evaluated. And perhaps you had more, and it's just morphine, because morphine isn't that potent. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's it's morphine, but it's relative to newer opioids like oxycodone or certainly fentanyl or heroin or hydrocodone. It's not as potent. So what was your physician also prescribing something like a benzodiazepine like Xanax or Valium? Because then maybe I could understand that. But all right, we're getting a call. Awesome. Let's see if this works. So it looks like we're.
I want to ask this question in public, but how do you stop porn?
How do you stop what? Oh. Weird. It sounds like we lost our connection there. Feel free to call back in. Okay. So I had distal bicep surgery the other day. Oof. That sounds very rough. So fine in town. Is it not? Why isn't it letting me? Sorry, okay, let's try this. Getting a different call. It looks like we are connected. What's your name and where are you calling from? Are you there?
Yeah, I'm there.
Okay, what's your name and where are you calling from?
Hey, my name's Terry. I'm calling from the west coast of Canada.
The west coast of Panama?
Vancouver. Yeah, I'm up near Vancouver.
Oh, Canada. Sorry, I thought you said Panama. Okay, awesome. Thanks for calling. So what's on your mind, man?
Hey, I just wanted to jump in on your conversation there. I'm a guy who said he was overdosed 4 times.
Right.
If my doctor did apologize to me for almost killing me, and those were his words. I'm really sorry, Terry. I almost killed you. And after that, I accepted his apology, and we started working on how to get me off the morphine. We did that, and I was successful in doing it. I'm a cancer survivor, by the way. I had squamous cell carcinoma, base of my tongue. It wrapped around my carotid artery.
Wow.
And I had a radical neck dissection, 36 rounds of chemo or radiation.
Wow.
And 3 rounds of chemo. One half of my neck was partially removed. And when they did that, the nerves were damaged severely. I can't feel anything in my throat.
Wow.
So swallowing becomes really difficult. Also, I lost my saliva glands, which also makes life interesting. And the surgery point is painful to this day, and the surgery was in 2005. So
jeez.
it feels like the day I woke up every day from surgery.
That is wow.
So my doctors had me on morphine for about 12 years until after the 4th time that happened, my wife had to call 911, have the fire department come, and they brought me back with Narcan. And after that point, that was when we got off.
Wow.
And
So Terry, let me ask you this. Terry, let me ask you. So were you prescribed anything else beyond the morphine, or was it just the morphine?
It was morphine, gabapentin, and Cymbalta. The Cymbalta was for the depression.
Sure.
You go through a lot being in this much trauma all the time.
I can only imagine.
Right? Like waking up is like waking up into a trauma scene. And if I was to give this pain to a normal person, they would just fall on the floor screaming.
Yeah.
But without the morphine, the gabapentin, and the Cymbalta, kind of keep it at bay, and I use a little pot for a distraction.
Sure.
But really, all you can do with pain this high is to distract yourself away from it.
Right.
Because the opiates will just end up killing you eventually. It was 12 years that I was on the opiates, so a doctor in Calgary told me that it can cause your blood to start oxygenating, or deoxygenating, or oxidizing, or something. But it was to the point where I'd go on an airplane and I would start to pass out immediately.
Wow.
From my blood oxygen going so low.
Yeah.
I walked into a hospital one time and it was registered at 54.
Whoa. Jeez.
Yeah, I'm not kidding. 54.
Jeez. Well,
So,
listen, Terry.
in my
I mean,
opinion,
I
opiates are just horrid.
well, yeah. I mean, listen. You've had I mean, I don't know if anybody has had a similarly traumatizing experience involving just, you've dealt with a lot, man. And I mean, it's
a lot of people have had to go through a lot worse than I had.
Sure.
I'm sure.
Sure, but
I'm a
that's
pretty tough guy. I'm a tough kid from Alberta. I can take a lot of beating I'm Irish, so, you know.
Yeah, I have some
Keep
friends
going,
from Alberta.
keep going.
Yeah, I have some friends from that neck of the
I have
woods.
another question for you. I have some
Sure.
pretty rough nerve pain,
Yeah.
and it's all nerve pain, right?
Yep.
Like it's all in my head.
Yep.
But it's causing some problems with my right hand. That is all interconnected. I used to be able to play darts, and now I can't spin a dart out of my fingers like I used to be able to. Is that all interconnected up in that bundle up in my neck?
Well, I mean, so, you know, it's hard to know the extent of the surgery that you described. But, you know, certainly the control of everything that you voluntarily move, well, everything, but including everything you voluntarily move, does indeed travel through the spinal cord. And, you know, so my ability to move this, you know, my fingers like this, those signals are, you know, first traveling from my brain down to my fingers, but then also there are signals traveling from my fingers back up to my brain to give you a sense of like, you know, I'm holding this pen, and so, you know, so that you know that you don't crush it, or you don't, you know, like just drop it because you're not holding it tightly enough. So yeah, there's a constant back and forth, and so it could be the case that as a function of the surgery, the you know, the nerves that you know travel along the neck may have been impinged upon, or somehow damaged, or maybe there's just some inflammation nearby that, you know, is interfering with or intruding upon the traveling of those signals. So it could be, but then also, you know, if you're experiencing chronic severe pain, you know, that is distracting. Like it's not only distracting because it's painful, right? And the sort of emotional toll that kind of pain can take, but also, you know, you're incapable of allocating the kind of attention, like physiologically, you know, electrophysiologically, the kind of attention that you would need to accomplish a specific physical task. So that's what I would imagine is happening. But I can't tell you for sure. Sorry, Terry.
With my right arm, on my right arm is you know, I'm right-handed.
Yeah.
A long time ago I fell and separated it playing football.
Oh.
Now that bone, right, floats around in there, and that arm is numb now. So, like, everything around that shoulder is numb in a big circle around where my surgery was.
Yeah.
Right up my chin, across over my ear, down my shoulder, down my back, up my spine, right through my neck.
Right.
So, my collarbone is numb, and now when I lift my arm up over my shoulder, I get so dizzy I'll pass out. It must be something blocking an artery or something, but it's causing me such dizziness. I have to quit my job now. I can't go to work anymore and lift my arms up above my head. So,
Jeez.
I'm 58 years old. What am I going to do? I can't lift my arms up above my head anymore.
Well, yeah. I mean, you know, just given that, I think it's safe to presume that there was some byproduct of the surgery that caused this. But listen, man, I'm glad you're you know, still with us, right? And you know, hopefully your physicians will be able to find some kind of strategy that mitigates some of this pain, because it's debilitating.
It's ridiculous.
Yeah. Well, thanks for calling in, man.
Come up with a drug that's not an opiate like that.
We're working on it. I assure you, we're working on it.
Well, keep up your good work, man. I watch you all the time. You do great stuff.
Thanks, man. Thanks for calling in. I appreciate it.
I appreciate it.
Yeah, I have some friends from Alberta. Alberta seems like a fun place. It seems sort of like, you know, I lived in Texas for a while, and it kind of has a similar kind of feel. It's sort of I don't know. It's just sort of a similar vibe, I guess, is what the kids would call it. Okay, on YouTube, youtube.com/anthropoid. Could any substance be microdosed? Would someone feel different if they took a really small amount of an antidepressant? Great topic, Mad Cow. So yes, I mean, you know, there's this classic quote from the person who's called the father of toxicology, Paracelsus. I believe a Swiss scientist from back in the day, where, you know, the difference between a cure and a poison is the dose. And so, yeah, like, you know, for sure. And you know, for a lot of drugs, all that you're going to get if you just take a micro dose of, like, what let's call, you know, the standard dose, if you just take a smaller dose, you're just going to get a smaller version of the same effect, right? You know, you may not pass certain thresholds where that, you know, determine whether or not you're aware of, you know, the effects of the drug, but it'll just be like a smaller effect, right? But for other drugs, because their pharmacologies are complicated, you can have almost, contradictory effects at different doses. So, you know, alcohol is probably one of the more intuitive ones where, you know, if you take, you know, if you have one beer, you know, depending on your size or tolerance, et cetera, of course, but like, let's just say for the standard person who doesn't really drink very much, if you just have one beer, right, you're probably going to experience a little bit of euphoria. Obviously, you know, some motor intoxication, inebriation, but not too severe. And some people become a little bit more energetic, right? They have more energy, they'll run around and be goofballs and stuff like that. But then, you know, if you have, let's say, 10 beers, that same person, then you have different aspects of the pharmacology begin to dominate. And so you'll begin to get sleepy, maybe not so euphoric. Obviously, you might get nauseous. And so, you know, and it's not that the pharmacology of alcohol has changed, right? It's just more or, you know, less or more of the same molecule, but it's that at different doses, the way that that ethanol, the alcohol molecule, interacts with receptors, the ratio of effects will begin to shift, right? And so when it comes to microdosing, you know, so just so everybody's on the same page, microdosing refers to, let's just say realistically, what microdosing refers to is the consumption of small, very, very fractionally small doses of usually psychedelics. So, you know, drugs like LSD or psilocybin, which is what makes magical mushrooms magical, or magic mushrooms magical. And so it really kind of became popular in Silicon Valley in California, but now, you know, it's not just limited there. And so generally speaking, that's what people mean by microdosing. And the goal of microdosing is generally to be for performance enhancement, to make people cognitively more effective, more creative, more productive. But then also for some people, mood adjustment. So, combating things like anxiety, depression, things like that. And I've talked about microdosing, but on my YouTube channel, youtube.com/anthropoid. I have a linked in the description. Link in my profile on Periscope. So many platforms. And people have derived some interesting effects, some interesting benefits. But it is certainly not something that has been researched sufficiently to the extent where I would be comfortable saying, yeah, we should all be considering this. So, but when you say a microdose of an antidepressant, the pharmacologies of antidepressants are it's complicated, of course, but it's relatively simple, right? They don't interact with like dozens of different receptors, at varying potencies. Really, the effects of SSRIs and SNRIs is that they cause the accumulation of serotonin in a synapse. That's pretty much what they do. They can interact with a little bit of, some receptors a little bit, but generally speaking, the main effect is that accumulation of neurotransmitter. And so, if you're just, inducing or achieving that pharmacological effect, but just, if you're just literally engaging fewer, monoamine reuptake pumps, right? If you're just, not engaging as many at a lower dose as you would at a higher dose, you're just going to get a lesser effect. It's not going to be like microdosing where, you're not, at one dose, you're hallucinating, right? You're having psychedelic hallucinations. At another dose, you feel a little bit, subtly different. So yeah, but the point is, yes, you can theoretically microdose anything. But the goals of microdosing really, probably ought to only, be associated with drugs that have a certain kind of pharmacology. So yeah, but it's an interesting topic. Okay. Yeah. Can you tell me how bacteria in the intestines can affect spinal cord and also the brain? Sure, Slow-Mos. That's a great topic. So what we are talking about here is the microbiome. And so not just bacteria, but mostly we're interested in bacteria. You said in the intestines, yeah, so in the gut. So we're talking about the gut microbiome. And I've also talked about the microbiome on YouTube, youtube.com/anthropoid. You know what? Sorry, I'm just going to fix something really quick because this is just driving me nuts. It's driving me nuts. Let's do 2. All right, sorry about that, everybody. So your gut, is, I like to think of it, the relationship between our gut and, body and, the microbial world, sort of like the relationship between fish and a coral reef, right? So, hello. And so, the coral reef itself, so the fish are obviously alive and they're moving and they depend upon the coral reef to survive. And, they seek nutrients, they reproduce, they use, energy, they create waste, all in the coral reef. The coral reef itself, however, is also technically alive. It's a byproduct of living organisms. And so, similar type of situation regarding our relationship with the microbes that inhabit our gut. So these, and there's a lot of them. So if you were to just extract all of the microbes that are living in my gut, the total weight of those microbes would surpass the total weight of my brain. Also, there are more genes that are expressed within that microbial community of your gut. There are more genes expressed by them than there are in your own body. So there, all of the genetic activity that's occurring in your body, most of it is bacterial, or microbial. Okay, so we've established what that thing is now. But why? Who cares? Like, why is that even interesting? Well, here's why. So, some of those bacteria, we all have slightly different signatures, slightly different, compositions of that microbial community, just like different coral reefs have different fish that live there. And, the population of fish can change, day to day, year to year, whatever. Some fish begin to expand, their population, their colony. Some fish just leave, right? Every now and then you get a shark or whatever, right? Similar type of thing can happen with the microbial communities in your gut, right? Even, but generally speaking, of course, siblings will tend to have more similar, microbiomes is what we call it, microbial communities. The types of bacteria that inhabit their gut. Dizygotic twins or fraternal twins will tend to have even more similar than just normal siblings. Identical twins or monozygotic twins will tend to have even more similar communities. And so, but given all these, but they won't be identical, right? But given all these differences, some of these bacteria are capable of doing things. They're capable of creating molecules that wouldn't have been there otherwise. They're capable of creating neurotransmitters that wouldn't have been there if had the microbial microbes not been there. And they can do things like influence our metabolism. They can influence our predispositions to certain diseases. They can and now there's pretty solid accumulating data that indicate that, given the presence of certain microbial communities, if you have certain types of microbes inhabiting your gut, you're at an increased risk of developing psychiatric conditions like generalized anxiety disorder. Even PTSD has been associated with, certain types of microbes. And so, but fundamentally, your topic is, how is it that they influence these things? It is because they can release molecules. They can release molecules as a byproduct of, they can convert molecules that they get from, your diet, right? They convert them to new molecules. That can be very helpful. They can also be damaging. They can also release molecules that can elicit an immune system reaction, so that, you have an inflammatory reaction constantly because you just have these microbes that are living in your gut, and, you don't even know that they're there, but you just have this sort of slow roiling, slow boil of inflammation. Your immune system is just constantly a little bit active, and that can be associated with a bunch of negative health outcomes. And of course, things, and I talked about this fairly extensively on YouTube, youtube.com/anthropoid, things like having to go on antibiotics, right? Because you have some kind of bacterial infection. Having to go on antibiotics will not only kill all the good, the beneficial microbes, but they'll also, they won't only kill all the bad microbes that are infecting you, but they'll also kill some of the good ones as well. And so you're sort of like resetting, and then that renders you vulnerable to being colonized by new types of microbes. And, perhaps you didn't have any dangerous or negative microbes initially, but then you went on the antibiotics, and now you're vulnerable to all these new bad ones, right? So it's a very complicated issue. It's really interesting, very active domain of biomedical research. If you know anybody who's interested in neuroscience, going into microbiome research will give you some job security for the foreseeable future. But yeah, that's pretty much it. And if you want a deeper dive into the microbiome and I focused on the relationship between the microbiome, again, the microbes that inhabit your gut, and brain activity and consciousness. But those types of relationships pertain to more than just the brain, right? They can be associated with hyperlipidemia, can be associated with diabetes, with metabolic syndrome, with heart attack, with stroke, with things like that. So correct. And inflammatory conditions like, arthritis, certain kinds of arthritis. Okay, so let's see what else. Oh wait, back to YouTube. I have postherpetic trigeminal neuralgia, chronic internal shingles that spread to the brain and has been life-changing. Anticonvulsants suck quality of life out of you. Yes, right. Sorry to hear that, Melinda. The occipital damage affects everything, but overcoming the mindset of chronic pain is what opens the door to improving the quality of your life. Peace to all who suffer from a pain syndrome. Yeah, I couldn't have said it better myself, certainly. My husband's eye was damaged in 6 places. After 10 years, his nerves are reconnecting in a wrong order. If he looks down, his eye pinpoints. Light doesn't do that. How interesting. I mean, it's terrible to hear that, Betty. That's very interesting. So if I understand correctly, what you're saying is that if your husband looks down, his pupils constrict. That's interesting. Right? Pinpoint. Jeez. Well, I'm sorry to hear that. How did 6 places? How did that damage take place? I actually, when I was a kid, I was playing with a friend, and we were just roughhousing and stuff. And my friend had a bag of Dorito chips, and he swiped them at my face, and it scratched my cornea. It was excruciatingly painful for a long time. And actually, if I squint my eyes, I can sort of see where the scar is. I can sort of see this little, looks almost like looks kind of like a scintillating scotoma, by the way, but it's not a scintillating scotoma. It sort of floats there in my field of vision, but I can't normally see it. I have to really look for it, and I have to be looking at like if I were to look at the sky right now, I could be able to see it if I squinted my eyes. You're still friends with him? No, I lived in a different part of the country, and yeah, thanks, Frito-Lay, no kidding. And I haven't, we must have been 5 or 6 or something, super young. So Scott from Ohio, what's on your mind today, man? Good to hear from you.
Hey, thank you. Nice to see you again. I hate to take a tangential topic, I guess, but you were kind of discussing it a few minutes ago with the man from Canada that called, and you're talking about SNRIs and SSRIs, and I meant to asked you before, but I keep forgetting. So, have you figured out, you as in the community, what specific compounds in those classes of medicines cause the sexual side effects, or what parts of the brain it specifically how that works, right?
Yes. Well, I mean, so we don't know exactly the full extent of why SSRIs, and it's I think people sort of laugh, or not laugh, they just don't take it seriously enough that SSRIs, one of the sort of standard side effects that is anticipated, we know it happens to pretty much everybody that takes them, is completely obliterated libido, and then even beyond that, erectile dysfunction, an inability to have an orgasm, and so that is a serious side effect. I mean, we're primates, right? That is it's a thing that primates evolved to do, and so
It is the thing that I try to do.
You're right. It is the life goal, right? And you're certainly not alone, right? And we also know that SSRIs, and so in case anybody's unfamiliar, SSRIs includes drugs like Prozac or fluoxetine, those types of drugs that are sort of frontline treatments for depression, but and other psychiatric conditions, not just depression. Another one is Lexapro, Paxil, right? There's a bunch of them, and they all do very, very similar things, but they used to treat things like depression, but also OCD, anxiety disorders, bulimia, nervosa, panic disorders, a bunch of things, right? So they're very widely used. They're some of the most widely used drugs in the world. But okay, so But they're not the only category of drug that induces these side effects. So, for example, opioids are well known to reduce libido and make it, cause erectile dysfunction and have sort of similar effects. The pharmacologies of those drugs are totally different, right? SSRIs interact with the serotonin signaling system, SNRIs with the norepinephrine signaling system, and opioids with the opioid signaling system, right? With the mu-opioid receptor. These are pretty distinct structures. So the problem is that, libido, sexual attraction, is in humans is extremely complicated. And that's why you get, so many manifestations of attraction and so many, different versions of the kinds of people that other people find attractive, right? And then also just like the physical process of becoming aroused and then in a male, having an orgasm or having an erection, right? That is a complicated process, and it is regulated by a variety of neurotransmitter signaling systems, among them, of course, including serotonin. And, part of the problem is that to achieve an erection, a male cannot be in a sort of fight or flight situation, or at least it's very difficult to do so in a fight or flight situation for a variety of reasons, not the least of which being vasoconstriction, right? Because you're routing all of your blood to your extremities, and the idea is if you're running away from a lion, you're not exactly too worried about reproducing in that very moment, right? And so that's part of the reason for why your sympathetic nervous system is highly activated, and to get an erection, one has to have sort of parasympathetic dominance. And what these drugs do in different ways through different neurotransmitter signaling systems is they prevent that from happening, right? And so you're just unable to, one way to think about it is that you're sort of like unable to relax, unable to relax in a deep way. And you can zone out, right? You're not so focused on any one source of stress or something like that in your environment, but your brain is just incapable of fully descending into a state of relaxation where your parasympathetic nervous system can become activated and you can therefore achieve an erection. So I mean, fundamentally the answer is that, serotonin, also norepinephrine, also the opioid signaling system all regulate attraction, libido, and just literally, an erection and the ability to orgasm. So yeah, I mean that, apart from that, I haven't seen, I guess I did read a paper that went into the explanation for opioids, but you're not particularly interested in opioids. But yeah.
No, I took, like maybe 3 to 5 Percocets after. I had 2 surgeries at the end of the year. I had one at the day after Thanksgiving and one right before New Year's. And so I took 1 or 2 when I had my gallbladder out. Then I took maybe 2 or 3 after I had this sinus surgery and nasal surgery. So then a little bit, but I'm not like, I'm like, I don't want to be on this if I don't have to.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, and so, I'm more familiar with how it is that opioids do it. And, this would pertain a little bit more towards, more to longer term use of opioids. So, people who regularly use them either because they're prescribed or otherwise. So, they have been shown to reduce the release of something called gonadotropin releasing hormone. So that is a hormone, obviously, in a part of the brain called the hypothalamus. And what that hormone typically does is it stimulates the pituitary gland, which is like right next to it pretty much, to secrete what are called gonadotropins. So luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone in women. And that will cause the release, the downstream release of estrogen in women or testosterone in men. And essentially all opioids inhibit gonadotropin releasing hormone, reducing luteinizing hormone, and so over the long term, that is part of the reason for why people who use opioids have similar problems. I'm not certain, but I suspect that SSRIs may do something similar, but I'm not 100% sure on that.
Okay, because I was asking my doctor, and I hate to say it like that, she didn't seem concerned because she's an older married woman and never was a young male, that doesn't understand
Yes.
like what we go through. And I didn't start getting anything until I was in my 30s, and now that it's an option, I don't want it to go away. And it's like it's weird because even like I know that even if there's no libido at all, it's like, well, if I had no desire to eat delicious food,
I would still know, in my brain that I like eating food or drinking beer, and then I just don't enjoy it. It's like, what's the point? So it's like this weird duality that's like, I feel a little better, but then I also feel like I'm really missing out on stuff. But so she didn't seem like that concerned that it was kind of a broad ranging side effect. And I was wondering if there's any other classes of medicines. I had for like a week or two this it was an older one. I think it was called like nortriptyline maybe, but she said it wasn't an SSRI or an SNRI. It was like you dated those.
Yeah, that's a pretty old school antidepressant. I'm not certain, but I think it might be a cyclic, or maybe not. Yeah, it is an older school antidepressant. I mean, hey, it's worth trying. I recall reading that some people end up benefiting in this domain of side effects when they add, I think, an SNRI. If they're only taking an SSRI. I recall reading that. I haven't. It's not something to which I've paid close attention over the years. But I think what was it? It was like combining. If somebody's prescribed like Prozac or fluoxetine or Lexapro or one of those types of SSRIs, and they add. I'm pretty sure it was Wellbutrin, so bupropion. That was able to mitigate the sexual side effects, but I'm not 100% sure on that.
Yeah, because I was on. Oh boy, I'm not trying to get all long-winded. Maybe it's too late. But yeah, I think originally I had the fluoxetine, then I had bupropion, but then I went duloxetine last year. But the Wellbutrin, it was interesting because everything else made me not hungry, so I wouldn't eat, and I lost weight. It was awesome. And then the Wellbutrin, they had the opposite effect where I was so hungry and I gained like 40 pounds. It was no me gusta, and I still had the sexual side effects. But the last thing, I really hate to bother you. No. So you mentioned like the difficulty of having an erection, and then no libido, inability to orgasm. So, but I would notice with these, it was like, again, with going on and off of them, it would be if I would be able to have one, it really hurt.
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, so it's not just. I'm just like, oh, it's just the muscle is atrophied or whatever. Well, no, there's something else. It's like a burning kind of pain thing. And then the follow-up question is that, like I said, I had this nortriptyline for a week or two, and then once it expired, I'm out of it, and I'm still having that kind of pain. It's been another week or two. Is that I assume is it just still really lingering, or it's not like it damaged me somehow? I hope, right?
So, as far as I'm aware, these are all temporary side effects of the drugs. And, just because of the nature of how these drugs work, it can take a while for, your after they're no longer taken, it can take a while for those symptoms to abate, just like it takes a while for the antidepressant effect to come on board. But yeah, I mean, I've never read or heard of any kind of actual like permanent damage associated with this side effect that as a function of these medications. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. But yeah, I mean, you're not alone. That is people have that same reaction.
Okay, well, thank you. Because again, it's not like I'm uncomfortable talking about it with her, because it's just doctors. It's like I don't know how to explain it to a woman. Not to sound sexist, but it's like you have different parts.
Yeah,
you can't explain like I don't know what childbirth would feel like. Although I imagine it probably hurts, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
So I just ask. So anyways, thanks for help. Sorry to bother you. I got to run here, so I'll see you soon.
Thanks for calling, Scott. It's never a bother. Talk to you soon.
Thank you. Bye.
Yeah, I mean, for a while I've been meaning, the side effects, the sexual side effects of antidepressants, are very interesting to me, because like, it's not just that like the libido is gone, where people, oh, hey, from Cuba. A lot of my friends growing up are from Cuba. I lived in Miami. It's not that it's just like you don't get aroused. It's that sex almost begins to seem like an alien concept, like beyond, like almost like repulsive, and it's beyond just like you don't think about it, like it just doesn't come up. But some people describe like seeing it as just like this ridiculous, weird, aversive, repulsive behavior, and people describe their skin crawling when they think about it, when they're on these medications, which is very interesting. I mean, it's terrible, obviously, but it's very interesting to me, that there's clearly a specific effect going on there that's regulated by serotonin, that, regulates, some of the deepest behaviors and predispositions and drives that humans have. And like, there was a period where where like sexual, so I used to collaborate with somebody on Periscope who was a sex scientist, and like she was like an academic basically, and so I went through this thing where I like read up, because you don't really learn about like erection and stuff like that in graduate school, right? And I just like enumerated the whole process, and I was just like, it's shocking how complicated this is. Like, it's so weird. Seriously, opioids can stay up to 4 months now. I'm not sure what you mean by stay, but yeah, it's an interesting side effect. All right, back to YouTube, youtube.com/anthropoid. Link in my profile in Periscope if that's where you're watching, as well as a link to haps.tv. That's the other live streaming platform that everybody seems to be going to, including me. Yeah, wow, that's mind-blowing that the effects of drugs can be so different at different amounts. Clears up a lot of confusion. Thanks so much. Oh, of course, my pleasure. Yeah, isn't that cool? This is what you get when you mess with us. Ian, have you ever tried streaming on Twitch? Yes, I have. I've actually streamed a game, like a video game that I Cyberpunk. I've only played it like 4 times, and I streamed it 3 times. So, but it's a good game. I like it. But yeah, I think those videos are still up there on Twitch. I think my name is Anthropoid Psy on Twitch. But it's just a different kind of platform. That's all. All right. It's a surgeon gone wild with backbitters. A surgeon gone wild. Oh, are you talking about your husband? Oh my gosh. So it was a surgical mistake. Oh, that's terrible. Okay, let's check out some of the other comments. Effexor works well for anxiety. Yeah, and that's the issue, is that these drugs are more effective than I think they're appreciated as being. They're not as effective as we'd like them to be, and there's certainly plenty of room for improvement for this side effect that we've been discussing, but then for others as well. But they are quite helpful for the treatment of a lot of these conditions that otherwise are pretty debilitating, if not life-threatening. Okay. What a coincidence. It's not addictive, but you just cannot stop it on your own without consequences. Just ask your doctor about Effexor if you have anxiety really bad, and you're welcome. I will thank you so much. Is it addictive? Yeah, it's not addictive. Right. Yeah, you're talking about Effexor. Yeah. Why do they promote alkaline water when DNA is an acid? Well, so when it comes to alkaline water, just so everybody, in case you're unfamiliar with what that means, it just means basic. Just means like it's more basic than like a neutral pH. So like on the pH scale, it would be like a higher number pH. And so whereas acidic is a lower number. And so the whole alkaline water thing, that is almost pure nonsense. Like I haven't seen any example of people talking about alkaline water like that wasn't just complete, not even close to plausible. Like that they're talking about how it's just better for your body in general, like your body systems are evolved to function in alkaline environments. And it's just, so 7 being neutral. Blood pH is around 7. I think it's like 7.4 or something like that. But and it fluctuates a little bit. But like the reality is, if you're consuming alkaline water, what's going to happen is you're just going to burp a lot, or you're going to make a lot of gas once that water hits your stomach, and then goes into your intestines where it's already pretty alkaline. And so your body very tightly regulates your body's pH, because at a pH, surrounding proteins and cells and stuff, if a pH departs that wildly from, your neutral pH, proteins will begin to become, either ionized or deionized, and it will just, they'll be incapable of functioning. And so as a result, your body tightly regulates pH. And so you're not going to be able to meaningfully, modify your body's pH by drinking alkaline water, right? It's just a complete gimmick, a goop gimmick. All right, so I should call it a day. I have been using a new live streaming platform called haps.tv. I have a link to that on my profile on Periscope. I also have been using a YouTube, youtube.com/anthropoid. You can click that. I also have a link there. Otherwise, hope you all have a lovely rest of your Sunday, good beginning of your week. Hopefully some of you will be able to get some vaccines, but keep your masks on, stay safe, and I will see you next week for one of the final times. See you, everybody. All right, thanks everybody on YouTube for joining in. I really appreciate it. I know the Elon Musk, the Neuralink story can be a little bit divisive for people, but I feel like I approached it with an open mind, irrespective of how people feel about Elon Musk. So hopefully I didn't offend too many people with my skeptical optimism. Otherwise, yeah, so if you haven't subscribed and you dig this stuff, maybe you'll consider subscribing or liking if you can do that. And again, I've been using haps.tv. You can check that out. I have a link in the description for this video that you can go check out if you'd like. Otherwise, and always open to input, to advice, to critiques, and to being corrected. Of course, if anything I've said strikes you as being inaccurate, please correct me. Otherwise, I will see you next week. See you, everybody.